Chapter 4. The Mission of Moses. Repetition of Principles. Having now gathered up in the briefest possible fashion the general gist of the history of the patriarchs, we must pass on to the mission of Moses. And here let me impress upon the reader that the Bible repeats its few grand principles over and over again, only with greater detail as it proceeds, so that we shall find precisely the same principles involved in the history of the march of Israel into Canaan, as in that of the three patriarchs. It is the same statement as is contained in the story of Eden and in the tradition of the flood, and we shall find it repeated throughout the Bible under other varieties of form which admit of more and more specific application of these principles to individual cases. I mention this to explain why we may sometimes appear to go over old ground. There is only one truth, and more detailed acquaintance with it will not change its fundamentals. We have seen that the Bible teaching regarding man starts with two great facts. First, that he is in the image of God, reproducing in individuality the same universal mind which is the origin of all things, and thus reproducing also its creative process of thought. And secondly, that he is ignorant of this truth, and so brings upon himself all sorts of trouble and limitations. And it is the process of the Bible to lead us step by step out of this ignorance into this knowledge, step by step, for it is a process of growth, first in the individual, then in the race. And this growth depends on certain clear and ascertainable laws inherent in the constitution of man. Now, the peculiarity of inherent law is that it always acts uniformly, making no exception in favor of anyone, and it does this as well as positively as negatively. Ignorant obedience. Our ignorance of any law of nature will never exempt us from its operation, and this is true of ignorant obedience as of ignorant disobedience. The natural reward of ignorant disobedience is no less certain than the natural punishment of ignorant disobedience, and it is on this principle that the great leaders of the race have always worked. They themselves knew the law, but to impart the understanding of the law to the people in general was not the work of the day, nor of a generation, nor of many generations. In fact, it is a work which is still only in its infancy, and therefore if people were to be saved from the consequence of disobedience to the law, it could only be by some method of training which would lead them into ignorant obedience to it. But this was not to be done by making any false statement of the law, for truth can never come out of falsehood. It must be done by presenting the truth under such figures as would indicate the real relations of things, though not explaining how these relations arise, because to undeveloped minds such an explanation would be worse than useless. Hence came the whole system of the Mosaic law. One Spirit. On one occasion, when the Master was asked which was the greatest commandment of the law, he replied by quoting the 4th verse of the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. Or as the Revised Standard Version has it in Mark 12:29, the Lord is one. This, he says, is the first of all the commandments, and we may therefore expect to find in this statement of divine unity, the foundation on which everything else rests. Nor need we look far to find the reason of it, for we have already seen in the opening words of Genesis that in principio, that is, as the originating principle in all things, there can be nothing else but God or Spirit. This is a conclusion which becomes unavoidable if we simply follow up the chain of cause and effect until we reach a universal first cause. We may call it by what name we choose. That will make no difference so long as we realize what must be its inherent nature and what must be our necessary relation to it. Whatever name we give it, it is always the one self-existent and self-transforming power, of which everything is in some mode of manifestation, simply because there is no other source from which anything could come. This ultimate deduction of reason is a recognition of the unity of God, and could not be more clearly stated than the words which Isaiah puts in the mouth of the divine being, repeating the phase in 2 consecutive sentences as though to lay additional stress upon it. There is none beside me. I am God, and there is none else. Isaiah 45:21-22. That is to say, God, or as we have learned from the instructions to the woman of Samaria, universal Spirit is all it is. This is the great truth of which the mission of Moses was founded, and therefore that mission starts with the announcement of the divine name at the burning bush. Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come into the children of Israel, and shall say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt they say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. So the name after which Moses inquired turned out to be no name, but the first person singular of the present tense of the verb to be. In its indicative mood, it is the announcement of being in the absolute, in the first originating plane of pure spirit, where, because the material does not yet exist, there can be no extension in space, and consequently no sequence in time, and where therefore the only possible mode of being is the consciousness of self-existence without limitation, either of space or time, the realization of the universal here and the everlasting now, the concentration of the all into the point and the expansion of the point into the all. The Egyptian connection. But though this may have been a new announcement to the mass of the Hebrew people, if you would have been no new announcement to Moses, for we are told in the Acts that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, a circumstance which is fully accounted for by his education at the court of Pharaoh, where he would be as a matter of course initiated into the deepest mysteries of the Egyptian religion. He must therefore have been familiar from boyhood with the words, I am that I am, which as the inscription, Nuk Pu Nuk, appeared on the walls of every temple, and having received the highest instruction in the land, brought up as a son of the Pharaoh's daughter, he must have been well aware of their significance. But this instruction had hitherto been confined to those who had been initiated into the great mysteries of Osiris. In whatever way we may interpret the story of Moses' meeting with the divine being at the burning bush, one thing is evident. It indicates a point in his career when it became plain to him that the only possible way for the liberation of mankind was through the universal recognition of that truth which till now had been the exclusive secret of the sanctuaries. What, then, was the great central truth which was thus announced in this proclamation of the divine name? It has two sides to it. First, that pure spirit is the ultimate essence of all that is, and as a consequence, the all-presence, the all-knowledge, the all-livingness, and the all-lovingness of God. Then, as a corollary of that proposition that spirit is all that is, there must be the converse proposition that all that is spirit. And since man is included in the all, we are again brought back to the original description of him as the image and likeness of God. But in those days, people had to be educated up to these two great truths, and they have not yet advanced very far in this education yet. So from the time when Moses' eyes were open to seeing these truths, not a secret to be guarded for his private benefit, but the power which was to be expanding to the renovation of the world, he realized that it was his mission to set man free by educating them gradually into the true knowledge of the divine name. Then he conceived a great scheme. The mysteries in religion. Modern research has shown us that the knowledge of this great fundamental truth was not confined to Egypt, but formed the ultimate center of all the religions of antiquity. It was that secret in which the supreme initiation of all the highest mysteries culminated. It could not be otherwise, for it was the only ultimate conclusion to which generations of clear-headed thinkers could come. But these were sages, priests, philosophers, men of education and leisure, and his final deduction was beyond the reach of the toiling multitudes, whose whole energies had to be devoted to the earning of their daily bread. Still, it was impossible for these thinkers who had arrived at the great knowledge to pass over the multitudes without allowing them at least a few crumbs from their table. The true recognition of the self must always carry with it a purpose of helping others to acquire. It also, but it does not necessarily imply the immediate perception of the best means of doing so. And hence throughout antiquity we find an inner religion, the supreme mysteries for the initiated few, and an outer religion for the most part idolatrous for the people. The people were not to be left without any religion, but they were given a religion which was deemed suited to their gross apprehension of things, and in the hands of lower orders of priests themselves little, if at all, better instructed than the worshippers. These conceptions often became very gross indeed. Nevertheless, in the first intention, the idols were not without meaning. The cultured Greeks laughed at the Egyptian temples as places where, in the midst of a magnificent edifice, when the sacred curtain of the innermost sanctuary was withdrawn, there was revealed an onion or a cat. Yet here was surely enough to prompt an intelligent person to inquiry. Why did the innermost sanctuary contain no Apollo Belvedere, or any other marvelous, unique, and worthy to be enshrined, but only one of these wretched animals which disturbed the rest of the Greek traveler newly arrived in Egypt by nocturnal caterwaulings, which must have been a marked feature in cities where pussy held undisputed sway? Or why was the odoriferous onion that lay by tons for sale in the market here set upon a pedestal as an object of reverence? Surely there must be some deep significance in elevating such common objects to the central place of mystery. Yes, because in these commonest of common things there appeared the great central mystery of life, more than in the sculptured marble of Phidias or Praxiteles. Thus the Egyptian religion signified, to all who had the nose to penetrate it, the all-presence of the eternal living Spirit as the one true object of worship, to be found not only in temples, but in streets and fields, and all places alike. It signified this to those who had the intelligence to lift the veil, and this meant, perhaps, 1 in 10,000 of the population. And as soon as he had penetrated the real meaning, his lips were sealed, for he was admitted to the mysteries. For the rest, the priests had such trivial, superficial explanation as those which, ages later, they sought to palm off upon Herodotus. It was no part of their business to lift the veil of Isis. And so Moses saw the generations toiling on in ignorance, which could not have been a disastrous consequence sooner or later. Under the paternal rule of a truly illuminated priesthood, such a relation between the inner and outer religion might be employed to maintain a condition of peaceful well-being for the masses during their intellectual infancy. But he saw that this state of things could not go on indefinitely. National calamity. With a general advance in intelligence must come a general disposition to question the outward forms of religion, while yet this general advance fell very short of that fuller development which in solitary instances led the individual to grasp the meaning of the inner truth. Then to any other nation comes the ridicule of all it has hitherto held sacred, because it has never learnt the eternal truth itself, but has placed its faith in forms and ceremonies and traditions, which, useful in their day and generation, should have been unfolded to meet growing intelligence. When this condition of the national mind supervenes, woe to that nation, for it is left without God and without hope, and by the inevitable law of nature on the plane of the mind it cannot but bring upon itself dire calamity. From the standpoint of the governed, this benign paternal government could not go on forever, and equally so from that of the rulers. What guarantee was there of the perpetual succession of priests illumined not only in head but also in heart? Egypt was old when Moses was a youth, and the signs of decadence were not wanting. For the cruel oppression of the Israelites, whom 4 centuries of naturalization should have placed on equality with the fellow subjects, was the very reverse of all that was truest in the inner teaching of the Egyptian temples. It was the index of practical atheism. The science of the temples continued, but it had reached the bifurcation of the way and had taken the left-hand path. And if this was the case in Egypt, which led the van of civilization, what was to be expected from the rest of the world? What was the outlook into the future with an intellectual development expanding only on the material side, without any knowledge of the spiritual truth in which lies the real livingness of life? Surely nothing but the ultimate destruction of mankind in internecine strife, led up by long ages that awful spiritual condition, in which the outward polish of materialized intellectuality only serves to place additional resources at the disposal of the unmitigated savage within. A new beginning. The system then in vogue had once been a valuable system, perhaps the only one possible, but Egypt was no longer young, and the day of that system had palpably gone by. What was to be done? That great central truth which the old system had handed down from hoary antiquity must be made the common appendage of mankind. Nuk pu nuk must no longer be made the mysterious legend of the temples, but it must become the household word of every family throughout the world. This is the work of generation upon generation, very far from being accomplished yet, and the only way to inaugurate it was by a new departure in which the great announcement that had hitherto been reserved as a last and final teaching must become the first and initial teaching. The supreme secret of the mysteries must be made the starting point of the child's education, and therefore the mission to Israel must open with a declaration of the I Am as the all-embracing one. A sentence consists of a subject, copula, and predicate, but in the announcement of the divine name made to Moses, there is no predicate. The reason is that to predicate something on a subject implies some special aspect of it, and thus by implication limits it, however extensive the predicate may be, and it is impossible to apply this mode of statement to the universal living spirit. There can be nothing outside it. Itself is the substance and the life of all that is or ever can be. This is an ultimate conception from which it is impossible to get away. Therefore, the only predicate corresponding to the universal subject must be the enumeration and the innumerable, the statement of all that is contained in infinite possibility, and consequently, the place of the predicate must be left apparently unfilled, because it is the fullness which includes it. The only possible statement of the divine is that of present subjective being, the universal I, and the ever-present Am. Therefore, I Am is the name of God, and the first of all the commandments is the announcement of the divine being as the infinite one. I have discussed the subject of the unity of spirit in the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science, but I may repeat here the truth that, mathematically, the infinite must be unity. We cannot think of two infinites, for as soon as duality appears, each member of it is limited by the other, else there would be no duality. Therefore we cannot multiply the infinite. Similarly, we cannot divide it, for division again implies multiplicity or numbers, and those they may be conceived as an existing relativity to each other within the infinite. The very relation between them establishes limits where one begins and the other ends, and thus we are no longer dealing with the infinite. Of course, all this is self-evident to the mathematician, who at once sees the absurdity of attempting to multiply or divide infinity. But the non-mathematical reader should endeavor to realize the full meaning of the word infinite as that which, being without limits, necessarily occupies all space and therefore includes all that is. The announcement that God is one is, therefore, the mathematical statement of the universal presence of spirit, and the phrase, I am, is the grammatical statement of the same thing. And because the universal spirit is the universal life itself, over all, through all, and in all, there is yet a third statement of it, which is its living statement, the reproduction of it in man himself. And these three statements are one and cannot be separated. Each implies the two others, like the three sides of an equilateral triangle, and therefore the first of all the commandments is that we shall recognize the one. As numerically all other numbers are developed from unity, so all the possibilities of ever-expanding life are developed from the all-including unit of being, and therefore in this commandment we find the root of our future growth to all eternity. This is why both Moses and Jesus assign it to the supreme place. Moses and Jesus. And here let me point out the intimate relation between the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of Moses. They are the two great figures of the Bible. As the Old Testament centers around the one, so the New Testament centers around the other. Each appeals to the other. Moses said, Of thy brethren shall thy Lord thy God raise up a prophet like unto me. The prophet that was to come should duplicate Moses, and when the prophet came he said, If I hear not Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. Each is the complement of the other. We shall never understand Jesus until we understand Moses, and we shall never understand Moses until we understand Jesus. Yet this is not a paradox, for to grasp the meaning of either, we must find a key to their utterance in our own hearts, and on our own lips in the words, I am. That is, we must go back to that divine universal law of being which is written within us, and of which both Moses and Jesus were the inspired exponents. The mission of Moses, then, was to build up a nationality which should be independent both of time and country, and which should derive its solidarity from its recognition of the principle of the one. Its national being must be based upon its expanding realization of the great central truth. And to the guarding and development of that truth this nation must be consecrated. and in the enslaved but not subdued children of the desert, the children of Israel, Moses found ready to hand the material which he needed. For these erstwhile wanderers had brought with them a simple monotheistic creed, a belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which vaguely, though it might be, already touched on the threshold of the sacred mystery, and 400 years of residence in Egypt had not extinguished, however it may have obscured the great tradition. Here, then, Moses found the nucleus for the nationality he designed to found, and he had led forth the people in a great symbolic march through the wilderness whose story is told us in Exodus. To the details of that history we may turn more intelligently after we have gained a clear idea of what the great work really was which Moses inaugurated on the night of the first Passover. Perhaps some of my readers may be surprised to learn that it is still going on, and they are called upon to take a personal part in continuing the work of Moses, which is now so expanded as to reach themselves. But all this is contained in the commission which Moses first announced to those he was to deliver, and grows naturally out of its unfoldment. The people he was to lead into liberty were the people of God, and since God is the I Am, they were the people of the I Am. This was true name of his nation, which was to be founded upon an eternal ideal instead of any historical condition of time and the geographical conditions of place. And this essential name of the new nation has been as accurately translated into its equivalent of Israel, as we shall later see the essential name of God has been translated by the word Jehovah. The people of God led forth by Moses were proclaimed by the very terms of his commission to be the people of the I Am. Now the history of this people is dignified by a succession of prophets, such as no other nation lays claim to. Yet the great prophet who first consolidated their scattered tribes into a compact community, in prophesizing the future of the people he had founded, passes over all these, and looking down the long centuries, points only to the one other prophet like unto me. We constantly miss these little indications of Scripture, on which the fuller understanding of it so greatly depends, and just as we miss the point when we are told that man is created in the likeness of God, so we miss the point when we are told that this other prophet, Jesus, is a prophet of the same type as Moses. The whole line of intervening prophets were not of that type. They had their own special work, but it was not a work like that of Moses. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the rest sink out of sight, and the only prophet whom Moses sees in the future is brought into his field of vision by his likeness of himself. Any child in Sunday school, if asked what it knew about Moses, would answer that he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt. No one would question that this was a distinctive fact regarding him. And therefore, if we are to find a prophet of the same type as Moses, we should expect to find it in him, the founder of the new nationality of the same order as that founded by Moses. That is to say, a nationality subsisting independently of time and place, and cohering by reason of its recognition of an eternal idea. I am, therefore we are. To make Jesus a prophet like unto Moses, he must in some way repeat the Exodus and reestablish the people of the I Am. Now turning to the teaching of Jesus, we find that this is exactly what he did. There was nothing on which he laid greater stress than the I Am. Except ye believe that I am, ye shall perish in your sins, was the empathetic sympathy of the whole teaching. And here read carefully. Distinguish between what Jesus said and what the translators of our English Bibles say that he said, for it makes all the difference. Our English version runs, If ye believe not that I am he, ye shall die in your sins. Thus, by the introduction of a single word, assuming all sorts of theological doctrines have their origin in Persian and Neoplatonic speculations, the discussion of which would require a volume to itself. Not false doctrines, but great truth are presented in such infantine notions as to convey the most limiting conception of ideals whose vitality consists in their transcending all limitations. Thus, both as theologians and grammarians, the translators of the Authorized Version felt the want of a predicate to complete the words I am, and so they added the word he. But faithful according to their light, they were careful to draw attention to the fact that there was no he in the original. And therefore that word is printed in italics to show that it was supplied by the translators, and the Revised Version carefully notes this fact in the margin. In the parallel case of the announcement to Moses at the burning bush, the translators did not attempt to introduce any predicate. They felt what I have pointed out, that no predicate could be sufficiently extensive to define infinite being. But here, supposing that Jesus was speaking of himself personally, they thought it necessary to introduce a word which should limit his statement accordingly. Now, the only comment to be made on this passage of the English Bible is to note carefully that it is exactly what Jesus never said. In this connection, he made no personal application of the verb to be. What he said was, "Except ye believe that I am, ye shall die in your sins." Now, if the criterion by which we are to recognize him as the prophet predicted by Moses is his reproduction of the doing of Moses, then we cannot be wrong in supposing that his use of the I am was as complete a generalization as was employed by Moses. On the same principle of which theologians or grammarians would particularize the words to the individuality of Jesus, they might particularize them to Moses also. But going back to that generalized statement of man, which is the very intimation the Bible gives of him, we find that if I am is the generalized statement of God, it must also be the generalized statement of man. For man is the image and likeness of God. Whatever is true of one is true of the other, only conversely, and as it were by reflection, so that whatever is universal in God becomes individual in man. If then Jesus was to duplicate the work of Moses, it could only be by taking as the foundation of his teaching the same statement of essential being that Moses took as the foundation of his. And therefore we must look for a generic and not for a specific application of the I am in his teaching also. And as soon as we do this, the veil is lifted and a power streams forth from all his instructions which show us that it was no mere figure of speech when he said that the water which he should give would become, in each one who drank it, a well of water springing up into everlasting life. He came not to proclaim himself, but man, not to tell of his own divinity separating from the race and making him the great exception, but to tell us of our divinity and to show in himself the great example of the I am reaching its full personal expression in man. The prophet is raised up of our brethren. He is one of ourselves, and therefore he said, "The disciple, when he is perfected, shall be as his master." It is the universal I am, reproducing itself in the individuality of man that Jesus would have us believe in. He is preaching nothing but the same old truth with which the Bible began, that man is the image and likeness of God. He says in effect, make this recognition the center of your life, and you have tapped the source of everlasting life. But refuse to believe it, and you will die in your sins. Why? As a divine vengeance upon you for daring to question the theological formulary to which some narrow-minded ecclesiastic applies the words of the Vincentian canon, quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus, when his formulary has never even been heard outside such limits as both historically and geographically give the lie direct to his assertion of always, everywhere, and by all men. Certainly not. Truth has a surer foundation in forms of words. It is a deep down in the foundation of being, and it is a failure to realize this truth of being in ourselves, that is, the refusal to believe in the I am, which must necessarily cause us to perish in our sins. It is not a theological vengeance, but the law of nature. Let us inquire, then, what this law is. The great law. It is the great law that, to live at all, we must primarily live in ourselves. No one can live for us. We can never get away from being the center of our own world, or in scientific language, our life is essentially subjective. There could be no objective life without a subjective entity to receive the perceptions which the objective faculties convey to it. And since the receiving entity is ourself, the only life possible to us is that of living in our own perception. Whatever we believe does for us, and the very fact exists, our beliefs may be erroneous from the point of view of a happier belief, but this does not alter the fact that for ourselves our beliefs are our realities, and these realities must continue until some ground is found for a change in belief. And in turn, the subjective entity reacts upon the objective life. For if there is one fact with the advance of modern psychological science is making more clear than another, it is that the subjective entity is the builder of the body. And this is precisely on what the information we have already gleaned from the Bible it ought to be. For we have seen that the statement that man is the image of God can only be interpreted as a statement of this having in himself the same creative process of thought, to which alone it is possible to attribute the origin of everything. He is the image of God because he is the individualization of the universal mind at that state of self-evolution, in which the individual attains the capacity for reasoning from the seen to the unseen, and thus for penetrating behind the veil of outward appearance, so that, because of the reproduction of that divine creative faculty in himself, the man's mental states or modes of thought are bound to externalize themselves in his body and his circumstances. This, then, is the law of man's being. I do not stop to discuss it in detail as, writing for New Thought readers, I assume at least an elementary knowledge of these things on their part. And accordingly, this being the law, we see that the more closely our conception of ourselves approximates to a broad generalization of the factors which go to make human personality, rather than that narrow conception which limits our notion of ourselves to certain particular relations that have gathered around us, the more fully we shall externalize this idea of ourselves. And because the idea is a generalization independent of any particular circumstances, it must necessarily externalize as a corresponding independence of circumstances. In other words, it must result in a control over conditions, whether of body or environment, proportion to the completeness of our generalization. The more perfect the generalization, the more perfect the corresponding control over conditions, and therefore to attain the most complete control, which means the most perfect liberty, we need to conceive of ourselves as embodying the idea of the most perfect generalization. But complete generalization is only another expression for infinitude, and therefore we have again reached the point where it becomes impossible to attach any predicate to the verb to be. And so the only statement which contains the whole law of man's being is identical with the only statement which contains the whole of God's being, and consequently, I am is as much the correct formula for man as for God. Sin. But if we do not believe this and make it a center of our life, we must perish in our sin. The Bible defines sin as a transgression of the law. And Jesus' warning is that by transgressing the law of our own being we shall die. It would carry me beyond the general lines of this book to discuss the question of what is here meant by death. But that is not the everlasting damnation of the Western creeds as obvious from the single statement of the Bible, that the Masters employed the interval between his death and resurrection in teaching those souls who had passed out of physical life in the catastrophe of the deluge, persons who most assuredly had perished on account of their transgression of the law. For further study of the subject, I would refer the reader to the works of two Orthodox divines, Farrar's Eternal Hope and Plumpter's Spirits in Prison. The transgression of which Jesus speaks is the transgression of the law of the I am in ourselves, the non-recognition of the fact that we are the image and likeness of God. This is the old original sin of Eve. It is the belief in evil as a substitute self-originating power. We believe ourselves under the control of all sorts of evils, having their climax in death. But whence does this evil get its power? Not from God, for no diminution of life can only come from the fountain of life. And if not from God, then from where else? God is the only being. This is the teaching of the first commandment, and therefore whatever it is some mode of God. And if this be so, then however evil may have a relative existence, it can have no subsistent existence of its own. It is not a living, originating power. God, the good, alone is that. And it is for this reason that in the doctrine of the One and in the statement of the I Am is the foundation of eternal individual life and liberty. So then the transgression is in supposing that there is or can be any living originating power outside the I Am. Let us once see that this is impossible, and it follows that evil has no more dominion over us, and we are free. But so long as we limit the I Am in ourselves to the narrow boundaries of the relative and conditioned, and do not realize that personified in ourselves, it must by its very nature still be as unfettered as when acting in the first creation of the universe, we shall never pass beyond the law of death, which we thus impose upon ourselves. In this way, then, Jesus proved himself to be the prophet of whom Moses had spoken. He made the recognition of the I Am the sole foundation of his work. In other words, he placed before men the same radical and ultimate conception of being that Moses had done, but with a difference. Moses elaborated this conception from the standpoint of the universal. Jesus elaborated from that of the individual. The work of Moses must necessarily precede that of Jesus, for if the universal mind is not in some measure apprehended first, the individual mind cannot be apprehended as its image and reflection. But it takes the teaching of both Moses and Jesus to make the complete teaching, for each is the complement to the other, and it is for this reason that Jesus said he came not to destroy the law but to fulfill. Jesus took up the work where Moses left off and expanded Moses' initial conception of the people founded on the recognition of the unity of God and its proper outcome of the conception of a people founded on the recognition of the unity of man as the expression of the unity of God. How can we doubt that this latter conception also was in the mind of Moses? Had it not been, he would not have spoken of the prophet like unto himself that should come hereafter. But he saw the ages during which this great idea must germinate within the limits of a single nationality before it could expand to humanity at large. And therefore, before Jesus could gather into one the people of the I Am, from every nation under heaven, it was necessary that one exclusive nation should be the official custodian of the great secret and mature it till the time it was right for the formation of that great international nationality, which is only now beginning to show forth its earliest blossoms. End of chapter.